So I am Brendan Kunzel,
I'm Savannah Phelps.
and this is our project. We're Team 16.
We both go to El Dorado. I did most of the research for this project, and Brendan did the coding aspect.
And before we go further, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Just understand that we will most likely finish our current thought before acknowledging the question.
All right, so to jump in, our project is meant to find a way to increase the chances of survival for ponderosa seeds that are planted via autonomous drones in wildfire burned areas. We've done a lot of research about drone reforestation, which is a relatively new effort led by a couple companies that we've researched, where they just use very large drones with seed capsules and fly over deforested areas and replant the seeds. We've noticed that in these efforts, a lot of times they just use very simple methods and the drones aren't autonomous. So we wanted to create a way where the drones would optimize the survival of these ponderosa seeds by finding the exact right areas to plant seeds and pathfinding between those. In this way, we'd be able to make sure that the most seeds survived over the next few years. And we decided we were able to measure our success based off of a mortality rate that we found in our research and the results of our model, which is basically modeling a randomized terrain that the drones can fly over and plant seeds on.
So this is an example of how the reforestation works. These pods are in the drone and they are fired at the ground, which is actually very good for us because since they're being fired with force at the ground, they are much less likely to be affected by things like wind and such, because they're not going to move too much if they're moving at relatively high speeds.
Yeah, the companies that we've researched, such as Drone Seed and Biocarbon Engineering, said that the drones travel between 150 and 300 meters per second, and they can usually plant 100,000 seeds per day, which is significantly more than the average human. Even if they're a very experienced planter, they can usually only plant like 2,500 seeds per day if they're very good. And also these drones are not autonomous. Usually it's just one person controlling one drone or perhaps a swarm of drones.
And unfortunately, even when controlling a swarm of drones, it's less moving all of them together, except moving one at a time, since then they don't have to refill as often. It's still the speed of one person and one drone, just without that refill time.
So we've done a lot of research on ponderosa pines and specifically forest fires. We decided to make our project specifically about replanting ponderosa pines because we wanted to make this project as specialized to New Mexico as we possibly could. We decided that ponderosa pines were pretty common. Well, through our research, we concluded ponderosa pines are a pretty common tree, and so they're usually what will get burned in these forest fires. And so our ecological research was centered around ponderosa pines and specifically forest fires in the Southwest. In our research, we found that ponderosa pines are specifically sensitive to crowding and shade, which makes this project especially useful because by finding the best spots to plant our seeds, we'll be able to minimize crowding. They're especially sensitive during the first 5 years of their life, from seed growing up into a sapling. And so during these first 5 years, it's especially crucial that the right places are chosen for these seeds. So when there's a forest fire on these trees, usually the bark is able to protect the trees, but especially when they're young, they won't get protected. Right after a forest fire, there probably won't be another one, but a lot of other trees may have died following the forest fire that we're replanting from. And forest fires also cause a lot of ecological damage onto the forest. Sometimes they may help, but especially recently in forest fires, they caused an increased risk for insect attacks they weaken a lot of the trees and they make erosion a lot more common. Through our research, we came up with a basic mortality rate that will help us determine the success of our project. Considering those aspects that I mentioned earlier, we decided that with our more improved method, where we choose the best places to put our seeds, during the first 5 years of growth, about 18% of the existing trees would die per year. And if we didn't use our method, we just use our control, which is the method that all the other drone companies use, there'd be about a 28% mortality rate. I could dive into these a little bit further if there's questions about them, but I had a full dissection on those in our paper. And we determined that after the first 5 release sensitive years, once the trees have grown up and toughened a little bit, with our method, there would only be about a 3% mortality rate, and not using our optimal planting method, there'd be about a 5% mortality rate each year.
All right, so first we had to, in order to model drones planting on terrain, we needed the terrain itself. Our method was using a randomized method using the diamond square method. But a lot of the way it does this is at least in our program, sets the 4 corner places and it sets the 4 corners and then checks those 4 corners and averages the altitudes of them and sets that value in the center. And then from there, it makes a diamond with that center point and the 2 corners forming a triangle. And that sets this center area. And it keeps repeating that over and over again until eventually it has every value. And this is slightly more difficult to do in NetLogo because it's 3-dimensional, so I have to figure out a way to set those altitudes. So I've been using the matrix extension for NetLogo with their coordinates in the matrix itself as the x and z axis, and the value itself as the altitude or y-axis. And I'll show that when we get the full program. This is one of the models. So we have several different materials that appear. In this, you can see the brown of the soil where a tree can be planted, the gray of rock because trees can't exactly be planted, and previously burned trees, which I have shown using dark green. And as you might be able to see, it goes all the way down to the bottom, which trees won't necessarily go that deep, and neither will rocks for that matter. But for the purposes of our program, since we're only concerned with the top level, it doesn't matter much what's directly under them, and that makes it easier to see where exactly the different materials are. The altitudes are assigned using that method, and we have a couple ways that we want to plant the seeds. Mainly, they have to be 2 meters apart, because that way they have the higher chance of survival, and they're less likely to overcrowd each other and cause the trees themselves to die.
Yeah,
And
so in both our control and our pathfinding method, we're making sure that all of our trees are 2 meters spaced apart, because that's just kind of the basic requirements of planting ponderosas.
And the way we do this with our control is slightly different, because since we're not, with that control, we're not concerned with the way the environment is set up, whether it's flat or a hill or anything like that. It just, the drone plants a seed, moves 2 meters, plants a seed, moves 2 meters. Well, that's not what exactly 2 meters is here, because the difference between this far corner and down a little bit is more than 2 meters because the altitude. And of course, this isn't a slope. That would make it slightly different. But for the purpose here, it checks in a sphere around the last seed it planted and make sure, oh, this is closer or this is further away, depending on those conditions. So our control is, like I said, always places them 2 meters apart based on the drone starting position. Doesn't check for the type. So there's a chance this is albeit a very small chance, that it will plant 0 seeds because it starts in one corner and moves 2 meters every time. Well, there's a chance there happens to be a rock or dead tree exactly 2 meters apart every single time. And this is an example of that. We have it plant here, skip, here, skip, because each square in our model represents 1 meter. And the only pathfinding is it moves and fires the seed. It's not pathfinding. And like I said, does not check terrain types. And for our pathfinding, it actually wasn't as intense as expected. And because of the size of our model and the size of the terrain we were checking, 2 drones works best. Any more and it starts to become redundant. And the way it works is it divides the plot into 2 sections. And once I'm able to share the other screen, I will be able to show that. It divides into sections and identifies places to put the seeds based on a starting position and then 2 meters apart and the correct terrain. And it follows the shortest path from one point which the 2 drones start at the same point as if they had just gotten off, say, a truck or whatever people were using to transport them to the next seed. And the main issue that we avoided was making sure the path doesn't cross over itself. Like if you were to connect every seed, you wouldn't want them to cross over each other because that means on the way back you're not planting any seeds, which is an issue. And that's actually the same reason 2 works better than say 4, because if you have 2, they can each make individual loops. But if you have 4, all 4 of them will go straight and then just fly back without planting seeds, which is slightly wasteful. Why use more fuel to plant the same amount of seeds? I believe that's the end of our coding section on here, so I'll share the screen that I have my code on. Yes, it is. So one moment, sorry. All right. So here's our code. This is, oh, there we go. So as you can see there, we have our terrain generated, and our drones here are represented by these, they're cubes, but they look slightly off because 3-dimensional is not the best. But we have a couple ways of controlling this. At first, I just have to get rid of one of the drones real quick because it brought up 2. All right, so there are a couple ways we can control them. We have manual moving speed up and down, but that's not necessarily the quickest or most effective way to do it. That's just for troubleshooting if it's having issues. We can move individual coordinates by putting in, whatever those coordinates happen to be, and it'll move to them and fire a seed. And this, of course, has to be turned on because if you're trying to put in a coordinate while it's trying to run any kind of pathfinding, it's going to break incredibly quickly. And so here's our control. This places it every 2 meters, and there's the points where when I was moving around manually it is, but you can see the method. And this is actually a fairly good placement for placing them every 2 meters. As you can see, at 22 because of the one when I was manually adding things, but they are spaced apart to those 2 meters. So on the other side, we have our method, which will take a second to load. You can see it's testing several different methods, and some of these will be some of these will appear closer than 2 meters just because of how the spacing works. For example, this patch right here is 2 meters taller than the one next to it, so obviously that can be placed. And oh, my apologies, accidentally pressed the wrong button, which tends to cause issues. But it's checking a couple different methods, and whichever one happens to be the highest, when I start it, it plants the seeds. And like I said, a lot of them look significantly closer, but that's due to how the altitude's working with such a grainy placement. But if this were to be made bigger, it would show that they're not that close due to differences in altitude. Right. So unless there are any questions about the code, I'm going to change back to the other screen.
Just a note about the code. We'd received a lot of questions about physics and incorporating the weather. So for a while, it had been kind of the plan to, well, it was one of the goals of our project to be able to deliver the seeds while the drone was still in motion. And normally this would require physics if we were dropping the seeds from free fall. As the drone would move, we'd have to make sure to drop the seed earlier than we would want before the drone was directly above where we wanted the seed to go. But since the drone doesn't just drop the seeds, it fires them into the ground at really high speeds, this wasn't quite so much of an issue. And concerning weather and wind patterns, this shooting the seeds a lot faster would sort of help to negate some of the weather effects, but and that's also something that we could incorporate into future iterations of this project. And also, if this were adapted to real drones rather than just kind of a theoretical project, we would make sure that the weather conditions would be more optimal so that there wouldn't be a lot of wind. So that's sort of regarding physics and weather.
And on that topic, the weather, things like wind or rain wouldn't affect this as much. It would affect the drones, not so much the seeds. The wind, because of how small the amount of time is that wind is affecting the seeds, it affect more the drones, which would be slightly harder to model here, mainly because that's, in my opinion, better suited for a physical project than a modeling project. There are, of course, models suited for exactly that purpose, but for our purposes, it's better to just model the effect on the seeds. All right, so I'm gonna open up our presentation again. There we go. All right, so our method is comparable to the actual, the way they're currently doing it, which doesn't sound great. Of why would we implement this new system if the one we have is similar? Well, our method doesn't require as much human control. Of course, you want to monitor it to make sure no drones crash due to random circumstances. But more importantly, you can run multiple of these at a time. Say you have 4 different plots. You would either need 4 people to each individually run them, or 1 person with 4 times as many drones and as much time. This can run independently, which in my opinion makes it significantly more efficient because it doesn't matter how many you're running, it's only limited by the number of drones.
So as you can see, this is the results that we came up with based off of the mortality rate that I discovered earlier, as well as the results from how many seeds ended up being planted using both of the methods. So you can see that the red line on top shows that although it may not be much, there is definitely a clear advantage to using pathfinding in making sure that more seeds survive to adulthood. There are certain random factors in nature, of course, that you can't control, but there definitely is a much higher chance of survival using our method than what's currently being used.
And even for companies that are using this method, even if not for this marginal difference, it's more cost effective even to use this method because You're still using drones. You're using probably the same amount of drone because after all, you're planting slightly more seeds, but seeds in the same area that you'd have that many drones. But now you only have to pay someone to watch the drones as opposed to operate the drones, which is a slightly different pay grade, as well as it can get done faster. So
Yeah, and that's not even to mention how much more cost effective this is than regular tree planting efforts that are being conducted by the government or third party organizations. So basically, to conclude, our method is more cost efficient and will produce more surviving seeds than what is currently being used. And all of the trees have a much higher chance of survival when they are chosen more specifically where they will be planted.
and so ways that this can be improved for anyone doing this in the future. Of course, I myself will not be as I am graduating, but incorporation of GIS data. That was talked about in our interim reports. The issue is we were not able to figure out a way to do that. And unfortunately, I was doing research into a different subject about a week or a couple days before we were submitting our code, and I learned that there are ways to use NetLogo to implement GIS data that people have done. I myself was just not able to find those methods. So doing things like image analysis to figure out the different altitudes, and of course improving factors, mortality rate, how the trees will be affected. More
Yeah,
accurate terrain by, yeah.
it'd be nice to have more physical research so that we can determine the mortality rate ourselves. The way that we determined it was using a lot of USDA and Forest Service reports to be able to piece together something, but not, of course, factors in New Mexico that are unique to here and would change that mortality rate a lot. So we're not quite sure exactly how accurate our mortality rate is.
And then,
It'd
of
be
course,
nice.
more accurate terrain with GIS data would also help with that mortality rate of knowing where it's being planted. Because if it's somewhere we know what the mortality rate is at that point, which would always be useful.
Also more specific terrain than we were able to generate with our NetLogo. Obviously, our NetLogo kind of was just using pixels, and the more accurate and specific and large we were able to make our terrain, the more accurate our project would be.
And then, of course, improved weather, things like wind, and not just a constant wind, which would be easily adjusted, but constantly changing wind would absolutely be a improvement because real life isn't a constant 5 mile per hour wind this way. It can change speed, direction, so many things. And so by improving that weather, it'd make our model more accurate.
Also, if this project were to be brought into the physical world, there would be a lot more considerations. Like some companies, when they're dropping their drones, they will spray weed killer beforehand, or they will water it, or just in the terrain it might rain, or there might be wind, or there's a lot of considerations that would have to be thought of if we were doing this physically, but don't really have much of a factor just in our model.
And then those are our citations for our photos. Other citations can be found in our bibliography on our research paper.
Are there any questions?
All right, thank you very much. Judges, floor is open for questions.
Okay, since Steve didn't jump in, and I expected him to, this is Dave Janicki. I'm very interested in what you've done, and I think your demo was really nice to see, and good teamwork on this. I'm interested if you've thought a little bit about how this might work, sort of in more of a sequential process. You know, if you go up and look at the area behind Los Alamos, which has burned a couple of times, there's been a lot of growth over the first 5 years of a whole bunch of underbrush, whether it's aspen trees or sumac and some other things that I don't know. but you know, so you might want to look at how this approach works for other sorts of timing rather than just right after things have burned, and maybe sequential additions. And have you thought any about that adding into your system?
I personally haven't thought done research into the timing after the forest fire. Of course, things will always start to grow at some point. I don't know if Savannah did any research into it, but I
Yeah,
don't personally know the amount of time afterwards that we would do this.
yeah, it would be a lot more difficult to do it years following the forest fire because, like I said, they're very, very sensitive to crowding, and so I think they would have a much more difficult time surviving if we were to do this at any time other than after a forest fire. Um, if the land was cleared beforehand, like it often is for projects such as these or like government-sponsored projects, then that would be better. But yeah, there have been a lot of studies on the effects of crowding on ponderosa saplings, and the results aren't very positive.
This is Stephen. So I had a question about the net logo model with the use of the matrix, right? So the matrix library that you're using,
Yes.
or the extension. Why did you need that, or explain what that was used for versus just putting in like the Z core of the patches? Yeah.
Because of how our because of how the matrix extension stores all of it, I personally found it much easier to store all the values in there, so I can get it I can have it print out that matrix. I can see that much better than I can see the values in the patches. So that was partially for ease of use for me being able to see it, as well as if I'm monitoring it based purely on the values it has, I don't have to worry about the output into patches, because if there's a mistake there and I think it's a mistake in the matrix, there's going to be a lot more issues. So that's mainly for ease of use, as well as I found it much easier to do the work on the values using the matrix than coordinates.
Okay, and thank you. And then the choice between 2D versus 3D in NetLogo. Could this have been done in 2D, in the 2D NetLogo?
It could have. It would have been slightly harder for people watching to see it because you wouldn't know those altitude differences that were a large part of getting spacings correct. You could, of course, have the values just shown or stored in those patches. But I personally found it easier to see the effect with the 3D view versus a 2D with values printed on top.
I gotcha. Yeah, and in the 2D, you have the advantage of the GIS if this was to be extended in a future year. But yeah, I could see the 3D viz. Go ahead.
Oh,
Savannah?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say. The using 3D is a good jumping off point for future developments. If we had done this in 3D, probably the next step in this project, 2D, probably the next step of this project would have been to move it to 3D so that we can incorporate more accurate terrain.
Okay, very good. And one other comment too is just a lot of firefighting is they'll launch incendiary ping pong balls out of helicopters. And there's a lot of, there's some preliminary research and development in the last couple of years of using drones to, as we try to put out a fire, we often use fire to fight the fire, right? So your project would have a very natural use in what's the strategy for using fire to put out a fire. So it's a multi-use potential there.
Thank you.
All right, judges, we have time for one more question. All right. Savannah, Brendan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Bye.